Good afternoon, everyone. My many thanks to the University of Technology's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, particularly to the Dean, Professor Alan Davidson, for your kind words. Associate Dean, Professor Heidi Norman, thank you for your beautiful and very long introduction of things. Makes me feel old. But also particularly for your insightful work and certainly your friendship over many, many years. I am definitely humbled to give this Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Indigenous lecture, and I hope my organic ramblings live up to the honour and the many kind words that have already been said. Being first is something that I'll return to throughout my musings, acknowledging both the recognition but also the responsibility that comes with that. I suppose I'm reaching that age where, like my mothers and aunts before me, I may lurch around from one thing to the next, but I promise there is a point to it all. Professor Michael McDaniel, I'm such a great admirer of yours, and while you follow in some very impressive footsteps and some fabulous shoes at Jumbana, many of whom were a great support to me, I have to say I'm just a tiny little bit jealous that you weren't around during my time at UTS. So I am absolutely honoured this year to be the 2021 recipient of the Indigenous Australian Award in the UTS Alumni Awards. And I acknowledge that in receiving this award, I follow in the footsteps of some highly accomplished First Nations recipients, particularly my remarkable Waka Waka Mulunjali Tira, Philippa McDermott, Head of Indigenous Employment at the ABC, Gamilaroi and Gomeroi Commercial TV Trailblazer, Brooke Boney, and Gabbargal tech entrepreneur Michaela Jade, just to name the most recent. As a Bundjalung woman from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, matrilineal kinship has always been an important part of my life, and it continues to influence my ways of thinking, doing and being. Today, I live and work on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I acknowledge and pay respects to the elders of the past and those of today. It was the Eora who first faced the brunt of British colonisation, who first witnessed the abject disregard the invaders demonstrated for their people and laws. It was the Eora who experienced the first massacres of their people, with 7 recorded mass killings in the first 20 years of the colony. It was also the Eora who first resisted the invaders, led by the warrior Pemulwuy, who fought the British from 1788 until his death at the hands of colonists in 1802. In a chilling act on his death, one which was to be repeated many times over the next century or so, Pemulwuy was decapitated and his head sent to London for display in the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons. When I reflect what it means for me to be on Eora country and to do the work that I do, I think of the determined and persuasive character and actions of Gamarega woman Barangaroo. She was independent and strong and had her own way of dealing with the early settlers on Eora lands and waters. She refused food offerings from the British soldiers, made strong protests when the settlers overfished some 4,000 fish in Warrain, and threatened a soldier who was flogging a convict with a flogging of her own. She refused to wear European clothes or drink their wine, instead maintaining her traditional dress and bare-chested, proudly displaying her culture. Today, her spirit lives on. Today, Eora country has changed beyond anything the protagonists in these early wars could have ever imagined. And today, I am here on Eora land, over 200 years from Pemulwuy and Barangaroo. Here I stand, a Bundjalung woman, indicative of people across this country who have survived and grown in strength. My experience is worlds apart from that of the Eora resistance leaders and their people. And yet I feel a strong connection to the resistance of these ancestors who fought bravely to defend their families and their country. And I also feel a strong responsibility to continue that defence. Pemulwuy and Barangaroo, who in different ways led the first resistance of First Nations people to the British invasion, were joined in the next couple of centuries by many other First Nation leaders, other early resistant warriors, men and women like Yagan, Windarine, Tongalongareta, Nemalak, Jandamara, and countless others whose names were not recorded in this country's history. The armed resistance of these warriors gave way to new ways of fighting, Walk-offs like the one at Cumbregunja in 1930s, Victoria, led by the great Jack Patton, and the Gurindji walk-off and strike at Wavehill, Dagaragu, led by old man Vincent Lingiari. Political resistance and advocacy were honed under the leadership of people like William Cooper, Gladys Elphick, Essie Coffey, Mumshell Smith, and the amazing Anthony Martin Fernando, who in 1903 made his way to Europe, where he established new ground for the resistance. In the early 1920s, Mr. Fernando picketed the Vatican to alert the Pope what was happening in Australia. He then travelled to London, where in 1928, he engaged in what must surely have been one of the most creative and remarkable protests in our history. With hundreds of skeletons sewn into his cloak, he stood in front of Australia House telling Londoners, "This is all that Australia has left of my people." Women who were the engine room and leading lights of the 1967 referendum campaign, Pearl Gibbs, Joyce Clegg, Evelyn Scott, Loicho O'Donoghue. They, along with Fernando, Cooper, Patton, Lingiari, Coffey and Smith, all found new ways, new tactics to progress the fight for First Nations people for justice. Many of the names I've mentioned are unknown to most Australians, but they are part of Australia's buried history. However, their names and their stories are still carried in the hearts of First Nations peoples. It is these great leaders and more that I have looked to in my life. Their courage has given me courage, and their determination to find novel ways to resist has given me determination. The creativity of their methods, their use of whatever opportunities came their way, and their refusal to give up in the face of enormous adversity continues to inspire me. The spears of Janamara and Pemulwuy giving way to the solitary protest of Fernando, which in turn gave way to the strikes and walk-offs of Cooper, Patton and Lingiari, and the petitions and sheer grit of Smith, Gibbs, Clegg, Scott and O'Donoghue. I believe strongly that the work we do at Reconciliation Australia is in keeping with the history and the political culture created by our past heroes and heroines. Reconciliation action plans, good governance, anti-racism education, media advocacy, and all of the other activities we are engaged in are new ways of advancing the fight for justice. This resistance of First Nations people on this continent remains unbroken. So I chose to study communications at UTS in large part to ensure that I was equipped with the critical skills to enhance this resistance. It wasn't always that way. In kindergarten, when I was asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, I proudly announced that I wanted to be a go-go dancer in a cage. And while some of you may be wondering if I have achieved that, that is a different story for a different time. But with a surname like mine and a family like mine, this really wasn't an option. Through my family and my experiences, I was and am no stranger to politics and social justice issues. My grandmother, mother and aunties, role models to me and many others, set standards of expectations through their resilience and their own achievements of firsts. So when I walked into the Broadway Tower in 1990, my own and my family's expectation was that with education, I had a duty to give back. Amongst a family of, some would say, overachievers, I was the first to graduate with a university degree. Now, there is much I could say of my time at UTS, and it is here that I was first exposed to semiotics. But I have to admit, if I'm honest, it took me probably another 20 years to fully grasp and then apply the thinking of Levi-Strauss, Foucault, Derrida, and others. Nevertheless, this was the kindling that would be fanned by a speech in Redfern Park in December 1992 and set me on a career path. I am, of course, referring to the then Prime Minister Paul Keating's speech on the eve of the Year of the World's Indigenous Peoples, a groundbreaking public admission of responsibility of the negative impact of invasion upon our people. It wasn't just the content of the speech that struck me. As an Aboriginal person, I was very familiar with the issues being raised. What struck me was the powerful combination of the words being said by the person who was saying them and in the place in which they were spoken. It's this combination that moved me and showed a path to making a difference through communications, both personally and institutionally. Since then, as has been said earlier, I've worked across a range of industries in community, mainstream government and corporate sectors, but still I return to Indigenous affairs and reconciliation. Some would say it's predestined, but I say that this is what I am passionate about. This is where I need to turn powerful words and good intentions into actions. The Australian communications and media industry has rightly been criticised for its often poor coverage of First Nations peoples and issues. In fact, so poor was the media's record that in 1991, the report on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody made 4 specific recommendations directly related to the role of the Australian mainstream media in the relationship between First Nations and other Australians. Specifically, the Commission recommended that Aboriginal media organisations should receive adequate funding where necessary in recognition of the importance of their function, and that all media organisations should be encouraged to develop codes and policies relating to the presentation of Aboriginal issues, the establishment of monitoring bodies, and very significantly, that the industry and Australian governments establish training and employment programs for Aboriginal employees in all classifications. The Commission also recommended that the media industry and media unions be requested to consider the establishment of and support of an annual award or awards for excellence in Aboriginal affairs reporting, to be judged by a panel of media, union and Aboriginal representatives. Recommendation 207 of the report called for better training for mainstream journalists, including the establishment in consultation with First Nations peoples, with specific units of study dedicated to Aboriginal affairs and the reporting thereof. Noting that the fact that many Aboriginal people throughout Australia expressed disappointment in the portrayal of Aboriginal people by the media, it further recommended that the media industry and media unions should engage formal and informal contact with Aboriginal organisations, including Aboriginal media organisations, where available. Now, there is no doubt that the Australian mainstream media has come some way further. There is no doubt that the Australian mainstream media has some way further to go in achieving consistent quality reporting of First Nations peoples and issues. But I do think in the 30 years since the Deaths in Custody Royal Commission, there have been improvements. Most importantly, we've seen a steady increase in First Nations journalists working in the mainstream media and a huge growth in the reach and prestige of the independent First Nations media. When I was a student in UTS, there were very few Indigenous journalists that we could aspire to emulate. Mervyn Bishop was the first Aboriginal photographer hired by the Sydney Morning Herald in the early 1960s, and he remained the only one until the early 2000s. John Newfong was the first Aboriginal journalist at the Australian newspaper in the early 1970s. By 1990, Rhoda Roberts became the first Aboriginal presenter of a primetime news and current affairs TV show on SBS's Vox Populi. And of course, Stan Grant was in the early days of what has since become a stellar media career. Today, Indigenous journalists can be seen and heard reporting across most media outlets, and the First Nations media sector has grown in leaps and bounds. And on social media channels, First Nations voices are almost a sector of their own. Outside of the First Nations media sector, which has had a long and proud history of amplifying our voices and issues, we also see people like Brooke Boney, as I mentioned earlier, now on breakfast commercial TV, Narelda Jacobs, who's similarly well-known and loved journalist, formerly with Network 7, now seen across Network 10, SBS and NITV. We've had former and current London correspondents in Bridget Brannigan and Isabella Higgins, people like Carly Williams, Alan Clark, Lindy Kerrin, Amy Maguire, Miriam Korowa, Jack Lattimore, Rangi Harini, Dan Borscher and Madeline Heyman-Reba, to just name a few. They're all breaking news stories across the country, being seen on our television sets, reading the nightly news. They're all aspiring and reporting on First Nations aspirations and issues and other stories with knowledge and insights impossible for a non-Indigenous journalist. Universities such as UTS continue to prepare highly skilled and competent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander professionals in journalism, public relations and other areas of media and communications. The significance of this cohort of young and not so young professional communicators enabled to tell our stories and manage our messaging is enormous and gives me great hope for the future. Likewise, the UTS Communications degree has played an important role in developing a higher skilled and aware non-Indigenous cohort of communicators, which is, after all, where the work of reconciliation must be done. It's no coincidence that Reconciliation Australia's predecessor, the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, launched a training video for journalism students at the Broadway campus of UTS with Ray Martin. So over the last 12 months, Reconciliation Australia has marked 20 years of our organisation. With the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation before us, we have a combined 3 decades of working hard to ensure that Australians fully understand the brutal history of Australia's colonisation and move beyond what Australian anthropologist Bill Stanner described as the Great Australian Silence. Stanner argued that Australia was gripped by a cult of disremembering that had reduced Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to little more than a melancholy footnote in Australia's colonial history. It is arguable that the past 30 years has been about overturning these historic attitudes, so eloquently described by Stanner, and replacing these deficit views with a true understanding of Aboriginal history and culture, and an honest appraisal of the consequences of the invasion and subsequent dispossession and colonisation of the homelands of First Nations. It's no boast to say that today there is a far greater awareness of the complexity and magnitude of First Nations cultures and knowledges, and many more Australians now understand the brutal impact of colonisation and the modern Australian state have had on First Nations families and communities. This attitudinal shift over the recent past hasn't happened through some sort of miracle osmosis, but it has come rather from the tireless efforts of First Nation peoples ourselves, supported by other Australians, including many thousands who have been touched by the 3 decades of the reconciliation movement and the work we have undertaken across workplaces and education sectors. Now, as I was tackling my second year of fried rice and curry sauce, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody delivered its final report. The report's final recommendation was to initiate a formal reconciliation process between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, a first for this country. And the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation was established through Commonwealth legislation with a 10-year sunset clause. Against the backdrop of the High Court Mabo decision, the introduction of native title legislation, the inquiry into the stolen generations and the Bringing Them Home report, the Council was tasked with raising awareness and consulting on a document of reconciliation. Not surprisingly, at the conclusion of its 10 years, Council had only scratched the surface of how to make progress towards reconciliation. But it did build a people's movement across a broad range of sectors and brought people together, firstly, through the Week of Prayer for Reconciliation, which then expanded into National Reconciliation Week, and then culminating at the end of its term with bridge walks for reconciliation across the country. Council also presented the Australian public a roadmap for reconciliation through a series of national strategies. So handing over the baton, Reconciliation Australia was created to take forward the Council's work, this time as a foundation independent of government. Learning from the work of Council and tasked with moving beyond sentiment and goodwill, the next 2 decades saw the development of the Indigenous Governance Program and Awards, Reconciliation Action Plans or RAPs, the Australian Reconciliation Barometer, the Workplace RAP Barometer, and Narragansett, a Reconciliation in Education program. All of these programs had the intent of expanding and engaging the people's movement of the 90s into active allies capable of making change. And to do this, we had to make the concept of reconciliation and the challenges First Nations peoples faced relevant to the lives of ordinary Australians. Our fates had to be aligned. Now, without a doubt, our Workplace Reconciliation Action Plans is our most well-known program. In 2006, we started with 8 trailblazer organisations, and today there are 2,080 organisations across every sector of Australian society. There are 3.9 million people who work or study in a RAP organisation, which represents over 25% of Australia's working age population. According to reporting, in the last financial year, 59,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are employed with a RAP organisation, and $2.8 billion in goods and services procured from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander businesses. Over the years, millions of hours have been provided in pro bono support to First Nations communities and organisations, and thousands of formal and informal partnerships between RAP organisations and First Nations groups have been created. Creating a community of learning. In the last year, 50,000 non-Indigenous Australians received face-to-face cultural training, and a further 250,000 had undergone online training through our RAPs. Now, I'm not completely Pollyanna to think that all of these outcomes are solely down to RAPs. They are just one tool, and many organisations pursue similar outcomes and goals in different ways. But a 2019 program evaluation conducted by EY and the Wallatuka Institute at the University of Newcastle found that those organisations without a RAP were significantly less likely to pursue sustained efforts to advance reconciliation than those that did. In education, our Narragansett Reconciliation and Education Program has grown enormously in its 10 years. As at the start of this quarter, 8,814 schools and early learning services had registered to develop a RAP on the Narragansett platform, representing approximately 32.5% of all schools and early learning services in Australia. An evaluation of Narragansett by the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods found huge impact from our work in this area, with continued growth in the program since its inception. The evaluation also found that the engagement with the program provided a formalised means of delivering students, staff and families with regular opportunities to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. It also found very strong evidence that those schools that continue to engage with Narragansett maintain the reconciliation activities that they are already doing and increase the activities through time. Both the RAPS and Narragansett programs provide robust frameworks designed to support long-term change through ongoing transformation and public accountability in a way that is scalable. In addition to creating opportunities like jobs and business prospects, our programs have also created a network to address systemic and individual attitudes towards First Nations peoples. Run since 2008, our biennial survey, the Australian Reconciliation Barometer, charts the changing attitudes of First Nations and other Australians, and importantly, the differences and similarities each of these cohorts has when it comes to reconciliation. What we have seen across the more recent surveys is that the community is ahead of government in relation to constitutional reform, truth-telling, treaties, closing the disadvantaged gaps, and helping realise equality and equity for First Peoples. In 2020, Reconciliation Barometer found that 95% of the general community and 94% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples believe it is important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to have a say in matters that affect them. 81% of the general community and 88% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people believe it is important to protect an Indigenous voice within the Constitution, so future governments can't remove it. 89% of the general community and 93% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people believe it is important to undertake formal truth-telling processes in relation to Australia's shared history. 83% of the general community believes it's important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures to be taught in our schools. And significantly, the barometer found that over 60% of people want to do something to help improve reconciliation. So over the last 30 years, we've seen more people speaking up, speaking the truth, asking hard questions and seeing the hard facts, informing themselves about issues affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But if we're to transform attitudinal change into substantive change in the conditions of First Nations peoples and bring about true reconciliation, we must move beyond mere words. The beautiful artwork on RAP documents and education alone will not result in the change we need in this country. In a comment which eloquently captures the gap between education and real change, the great African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in 1933, "We have striven to, by book and periodical, by speech and appeal, by various dramatic methods of agitation, to put the essential facts before the American people. Today, there can be no doubt that Americans know the facts, and yet they remain for the most part indifferent and unmoved. Perhaps contemporary Australians are less unmoved and indifferent than their US counterparts were in the 1930s, but his comment, like that of Bill Stanners I quoted earlier, contain important lessons for those of us who are committed to reconciliation and justice. And the lesson I take home from these sentiments is that reconciliation is more than just raising awareness and knowledge. Reconciliation demands action. As a nation, and importantly as individual citizens, we need to move from safe to brave in our thinking and our actions in order to realise the promise of reconciliation. In 2016, as we marked 25 years of the formal reconciliation process, we pulled together everything we had learned at that point, both within Australia and across the globe, in the first State of Reconciliation in Australia report. For the first time in the formal process, we developed a framework to measure progress towards reconciliation, expressed through 5 critical dimensions that together represent a holistic and comprehensive picture of reconciliation as seen in this country. These interrelated dimensions are race relations, when all Australians understand and value First Nations cultures, rights and experiences, resulting in stronger relationships. Equality and equity, when First Nations participate equally in a range of life opportunities, and our unique rights are recognised and upheld. Institutional integrity, the active support of reconciliation by all parts of society, including political, business, education, and community sectors. Historical acceptance, when all Australians understand and accept our past and ongoing impact, make amends and commit to not repeating past wrongs. And unity, we're an Australian society that values and recognises First Nations culture and heritage as a proud part of our shared national identity. These 5 dimensions are dependent on each other, and improvement must be made across all 5 if we are to see progress towards reconciliation. This is now the lens we use when we view all aspects of reconciliation. So how are we doing? Well, once again, we find a mixed bag of results. The 2021 State of Reconciliation report found that support for reconciliation is growing, and as I mentioned earlier, that more Australians now understand the impact of colonisation and the modern state on First Nations families and communities. We have more people in institutions than ever before committing to and accessing tools to create change. And yet we still see unacceptable rates of First Nations incarceration, children in out-of-home care, and concerning rises in experiences of racism. From this, the evidence suggests that the reconciliation movement in Australia is at a tipping point, and that we, as a nation, need to move from a space of safe to brave on issues affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So Safe to Brave has been the theme of this year, and it's also the theme of our first reconciliation convention in 20 years, and the first held by Reconciliation Australia. As I said before, being a first isn't an honour, but it comes with responsibility. Responsibility to get things right and to be accountable when you get it wrong. Being first means you don't have a well-trodden path to follow, but must forge your own way. And when leading into the unknown, whether in front or from behind, you must build trust and confidence that where we are headed will be better than when we are. Last month's Australian Reconciliation Convention saw more than 1,600 participants joining us on an online platform to hear close to 100 speakers across 30 sessions over 3 days. The majority of speakers were First Nations, and with one request to be respectful in their discussions and of other speakers, they were let loose across a range of topics, from transformative relationships to bursting bubbles of self-belief, from dismantling structural racism to authentic truth-telling. These were topics not defined by Reconciliation Australia, but determined by First Nations peoples, allies and critics alike. Knowing and accepting the truth is fundamental to reconciliation. Our speakers range from some of the trailblazers of the early days of reconciliation, such as Dr. Jackie Huggins, Uncle Bill or Belzaloa, Fred Chaney and Shelley Rays, to some of our youngest participants in education programs and early learning services. We honoured the past and the work that's been done, the foundations laid. We honoured the present and the mountains of work being done in our communities, workplaces, schools and universities, cultural institutions and local government. And we looked ahead to what we need to do to keep or start doing now to reach a braver future. The passion for a braver future was vividly on display during these 3 days. Uncle Belzaloa, who was a former CAR member, implored Australians to get on board with reconciliation, to work with hope and buoyancy and optimism. And as he said, blackfellas are offering a wild ride. Get on it and find out what it's all about. Like the hundreds of thousands of Australians who walked across bridges in 2000, Australians of goodwill must take the next step and shift from a passive state of merely believing in reconciliation to taking substantive action to expedite change and ultimately achieve reconciliation and justice. As a nation, Australia must act on this change of public sentiment with real structural change, starting with the proposal by the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Actions must involve truth-telling and actively address issues of inequality, systemic racism, and instances where the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are ignored, denied, or reduced. And the original wrong, the dispossession of First Nations of Australia, must be addressed with a new respect for the unceded sovereignty of these nations. As the Uluru Statement itself states, sovereignty was never ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed a land of 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years. With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe that this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. It is precisely this fuller expression of Australia's nationhood that Reconciliation Australia seeks to engender in our work. Australians of goodwill must move from being allies to First Nations peoples and become effective accomplices in achieving change. Sporting clubs and codes, professional bodies and trade unions, faith groups, schools and early learning centres, universities, cultural institutions and some of Australia's largest corporations are all actively engaged in walking alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in our quest for a better, more just and equitable Australia. They don't always get it right, and there's a lot to turn around after 250 years. But we have gotten better in the last 30 years of owning our mistakes and identifying the gaps. And as Uncle Bells has said, the quicker First Nations people are joined on our wild ride, the sooner we'll get to a more just and equitable place. As I circle back to where I began in Redfern Park, where my own fire in the belly was fanned, I'll leave you with a quote which I believe very powerfully sums up what's at stake. The quote is from Paul Keating's Redfern Park speech, the speech that inspired me and set me on a lifetime career and path of reconciliation. He said, "We cannot imagine that the descendants of people whose genius and resilience maintained a culture here through 50,000 years or more, through cataclysmic changes to the climate and environment, and who then survived 2 centuries of dispossession and abuse. We cannot believe that they will be denied their place in the modern Australian nation. We cannot imagine that, but we cannot imagine that we will fail." Thank you.